Hey folks, we'll get to the interview with Dr. Tim Podlogar in a second, who I think is one of the brightest minds in endurance fueling, endurance nutrition. But I just wanted to share with you why we haven't been on YouTube in the last couple months, and the reason is because we just launched our app. It's called Saturday Pro Fuel and Hydration. It's like an endurance fueling coach in your pocket. One of the reasons I think that Dr. Tim Podlogar is so special is because he is one of the best at ruthlessly adhering to the truth and also having an athlete-centric focus. He works with Bora Hansgrohe, the professional cycling team, and works full-time in a lab doing studies on athletes. He has a coaching business of his own. You can look him up, Dr. Tim Podlogar, and I'll post links in the description.
So you got into cycling as sort of a vehicle to study sport. Was your first cycling experience, was it outside or were you in a lab truly for the first time?
It was outside. So when I was still sailing, there's like a local climb that I have like 10 minutes from my home. It lasts like 15 minutes. And I've been going up and down as a way to kind of get better in endurance for sailing. But I was on a mountain bike and I was definitely not into cycling. When I kind of transitioned from sailing into cycling, I was just like trying to find a sport. And I got my first road bike and I was obviously cycling outdoors. Indoor cycling experience only started when I moved to Birmingham because of the British weather. When I was in Slovenia, I was kind of cycling outdoors, and in the winter I was cross-country skiing. So there was no need to kind of ride indoors.
Gotcha. So Slovenia has sort of more polarized weather where if it's nice out, you're out riding, and then in the winters, it's just nice and snowy. So you get your fitness in cross-country skiing.
Yeah, exactly. So where I live, I can go out and obviously ride around here. But if I want to cross-country ski, I need to drive for an hour or so. And I get there and there is pretty much always snow in the winter. And I can do my training there. So that's pretty awesome.
Okay, awesome. Got it. So now that you're in the research, I understand that you seem to be very passionate about carbohydrate fueling and fueling endurance performance, but maybe you can tell us a little bit more detail. What specific things are you the most passionate about right now?
Good question. It's always how to improve performance on the bike, like how to get the cyclists quicker, less fatigued, improve fatigue resistance, I guess. And these are kind of the things that I'm really passionate about. And I always, when I need to introduce myself, I don't really say that I'm a sports nutritionist. I usually say that I'm an exercise physiologist, because I kind of try to read everything there is to be read about endurance performance. So altitude training, heat acclimation stuff, and everything around that. It's just that carbohydrates are something that I'm most passionate about. And this probably comes down to the fact that Birmingham, where I did my master's and then my PhD, is very well known for carbohydrate research, and a lot of work that we kind of use in the guidelines these days is coming from Birmingham, and that's probably why I kind of became passionate about carbohydrates. But I'm pretty sure that if I had studied somewhere else, I would be passionate, I don't know, about altitude acclimation or something like that.
You said altitude acclimation?
Yeah.
I gotcha. So I recall that there's a really big mountain in Slovenia, probably many, but there's one that's a little bit more well-known internationally. Well, I don't remember the name of it though. You can help me. Yeah,
it's not really tall. Triglav is 2,864 meters above sea level. I don't know how much it is in feet. It's not super tall or super high, but we had in the past many mountaineers. Environmental physiology is very well developed in Slovenia as a result of that.
Got it. So you kind of have followed basically passion for improving performance, and that led you, because of your location of study, towards carbohydrates. Is there anything else that interests you specifically about carbohydrate fueling, or is it just that the location is sort of you're just in an optimal location to do really good research on it?
Yeah, I don't in terms of sports nutrition, because kind of sports nutrition is something that really interests me, probably starting back from the days when I was kind of listening to Tim Noakes, and he was saying that it's about low carbohydrate diets, and I actually tried it. But then when you start to read about biochemistry, you actually figure out, no, it can't work. It has to be carbohydrates. And I have this feeling that when we talk about sports nutrition, we often start to talk about supplements and some things that even on the biochemistry level can't make such a big impact as compared to carbohydrates, because carbohydrates are basically the fuel. And without carbohydrates, we can't produce the watts, we can't produce the speed if you're running. So basically, that's something we can't live without. And in my view, we have to first optimize the carbohydrates because there is a lot to be optimized there, and only then transition to like supplements and those marginal gains that some cycling teams are obsessed about.
Sure. Yeah, we totally agree there. I think I'm passionate for a similar reason. It seems like it's the lowest hanging fruit for big improvements if you really optimize just the carbohydrate fueling system. So that's cool. I see it the same way. Next question. Do you have any like 5 or 10-year mission that you're on? Like, do you see yourself on a path or big end goal at the end of 5, 10, 20 years even?
Not really. I get this question quite a lot recently. I always say just I enjoy what I do, and as long as I enjoy what I'm doing, then that's fine. So I guess it was Steve Jobs that once said that keep searching and keep looking, never settle, and that's exactly what I'm doing. I just, don't have really goals. I don't have like academic goals. I don't have goals in terms of like how many research papers I'm going to produce. All those things are kind of secondary importance to me. I feel like that if I'm happy with what I'm doing, that's the most important thing. And at the moment, it's kind of partly research, partly applied sports practice with Bora Hansgrohe cycling team. And for as long as I enjoy these things, that's I'm perfectly happy. So I don't really have like long-term goals, to be honest.
Gotcha. Okay, I understand. I'm going to come back to that Steve Jobs comment because I find some of his thoughts very interesting too. But first, I want to ask you, so what is it now in carbohydrate research that you're enjoying most?
It's probably like how to optimize really the carbohydrate intake during exercise and before exercise and after exercise to actually fuel for performance for like long cycling races. Because we often like try to extrapolate the data or just take the data and recommendations based from the studies that were conducted using steady state exercise, for instance, like 3-hour exercise at 90% or 95% of the first lactate threshold. And then we say, okay, well, it's going to be the same when cyclists are doing 4-hour long ride in the Alps or in the Pyrenees. It's actually not the same because they have climbs, they go full gas there perhaps, and then they have descents when they do nothing. And this is something that there is a big gap in the literature, and I'm basically trying to better understand this. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to kind of study this in the lab, to even design a study properly. So I haven't even attempted to do that yet, but this is something that perhaps I would want to do down the line.
It seems like to get to where you want to go, which it seems to me is optimized fueling over the course of a ride at different fueling rates to match different demands during the ride. It seems like that's 20 years, 25, 30 years away in the research because we have so many questions to answer first. Would you say you agree with that?
Yeah, exactly. So it's actually interesting, and like I admit that I've been wrong in the past, and for instance, like working with the cycling team I work for now, like my strategy how to fuel for the long races has changed through the season. So the start of the season, I would recommend something, and then now at the end of the season or starting the next season, the recommendations actually are different. And things actually change based on my ideas, on how I interpret the studies that are out there. But a lot of it is just guesswork and hypothesizing and just thinking. And obviously I can be wrong because there is simply no research that we would just be able to just take and that's how it is, because It's so difficult to kind of investigate real life performance. So
100% agree with you. That is one of the things that I have sat and thought many hours about as well. That sort of more real world optimized extrapolation from what exists in research today, which truly is incredibly limited to very static conditions, static scenarios. So how do you, or if you're allowed to say, what what did you think and what did you change to? What were some of the details? Can you share any of that with your work with the pro team?
Yeah. So for instance, like one of the things that has always been bugging me was rides when they do like 270 watts on average, or even more than that. And the energy demands are vastly different. So how do you actually fuel the easy rides, and how do you then transition into those fueling for the like harder rides? Do you go with 120 grams per hour, even on easier rides? And then basically, and kind of those questions kind of keep appearing in my mind, and I keep thinking about it, how to optimize that. And for instance, like at the moment, for some time I was like, okay, perhaps like 120 grams is too much. Let's go with 90 grams. That's perfectly enough. Now I am back to 120 grams per hour, but not from the start. So I kind of do delayed feeding. It's always like just some ideas in my brain that, I kind of experiment on my own then and see if it works or not. And it's all about self-experimentation in the end.
Man, that sounds very familiar. I've asked myself the same question many times, both for myself as a rider, but also for my wife, who rides a lot more than me and trains for triathlon too. Yeah, that's a hard problem to solve when you have such low intensity for so long, and you need to keep performance high in case something happens, somebody goes off the front and they need to react, etc., or just to keep them fueled. Like in general, you can't like leave them low blood sugar the whole ride, and then I'm sure there's a million things that I'm not considering that you do consider every stage. So do you are you the decision maker? Are you the end of the road that says this goes in their bottles?
Basically, how we do it is like we have two nutritionists, and the one nutritionist is assigned to each race. So when I'm like the nutritionist in charge, then I kind of make a plan. So I talk to the people that are there, that are preparing the bottles, and I just give recommendations to the riders, and also like what should go into the bottles for each stage. And then we make a plan based on like the weather,
roles and tasks and goals, and how the profile and weather would affect them. Or is it more like, okay, this is the overall thing. I'm going to kind of bring my ideas to the riders, and this is sort of just say, this is probably what you should do.
It's kind of tactics in professional cycling are sometimes decided like in the last minute. So I don't really know everything, how it's going to be. But I have like a general idea. So you usually like for the Grand Tours or like very important stage races, I would probably kind of know who the best riders are. And for instance, with Jai and Alex, which are kind of the guys that I worked most in the last season, I would individually like prescribe the carbohydrates for during the ride and outside the rides, like the recovery and breakfast. Whereas for other riders, if they want like full support, they would obviously get it. But otherwise, we keep it like in a way that they're still kind of relaxed and try not to get them too obsessed with food. So we don't like ask them to weigh the food if they don't want to. But it kind of, we provide them recommendations. So for instance, like we pay attention to eat on this part of the race, try to aim for like 90, 120 grams per hour, things like that. Because I'm not a big fan of like doing very strict recommendations, like this is how it is and you can't eat more or you should eat less or whatever, because we never know what's going to happen. So from my perspective, it's best that riders understand what I mean when I give advice, what I think about, what my thoughts were, and then they can decide on their own. And then after the ride, the stage, they can like get back to me and kind of complain or say it worked very well, so I can also learn and improve for the future.
That's really neat to hear you say that you prefer to not give super hard specific recommendations and keep it sort of flexible to keep it relaxed for the riders. Because on the one hand, I think, those super strict recommendations can lead to disordered eating type of habits, especially in a really high performance setting where weight matters, like a Grand Tour when these guys have like lots of money riding on their jobs. So I think that's cool that you're like keeping it flexible for the athletes.
Yeah, like one of the things like when I started thinking about this was the fact that when I try to kind of predict energy expenditure for the future, I make mistakes. And then even if I know the power output from the stage, and so I can basically kind of calculate pretty accurately the energy expenditure, there is always something that's called efficiency that I have absolutely no idea what it is. And like changing efficiency on the bike, like from 22% to 24%, makes a massive difference in the total energy demands for a day. So we can be probably like the error of estimation can be plus minus at least 400 calories on a daily basis. And this is like 100 grams of carbohydrates. And that's a lot. So basically giving them like still a flexibility, I think that kind of makes sense even from this perspective.
Yeah, totally agree. What is the widest, two questions. What's the widest range of carbohydrates that you have prescribed when you are trying to tailor to something like the race course profile? Or the efforts expected during the day? For example, rider A, please drink 60 grams of carbs per hour for the first hour and a half, and then please drink 130 grams of carbs. That'd be a difference of 70. Like towards the end of the race, they are consuming 130. What's the widest range you've ever said to a rider?
At like the moment, I say that they should go with like pretty much zero carbohydrates from the start, and the stage with like 120 grams per hour or even more. So that's how it is at the moment.
Okay. And then, and the reason for that zero recommendation at the start is, they're riding relatively conservatively when they're in the peloton. There's a huge draft benefit. So their watts are like 160 watts or something silly. And these guys are guys who can hold much, like double that for a long time. And also because there's an energy balance concern that you don't want them to actually overshoot their kcal needs for the day. It's
actually because of when I compared and looked at the both 120 gram studies that came out this year, so my study and the one by Harris and colleagues. And one of the things that happened in my study was that basically carbohydrate oxidation rates were basically the same for the whole 3 hour long session. Fat oxidation rate did not increase and was actually very suppressed. On the other hand, the other study, 120 grams by Harris and colleagues, they had 4 or 3 different conditions. They actually saw an increase in fat oxidation rates over time. And I was like, why the heck is this different? And I think I'm pretty sure that that's the thing is that in our case, we gave people lots of carbohydrates at the start to kind of maximize and actually achieve peak exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates as quickly as possible. So to get like to the highest rates as quickly as possible from the start. Whereas in their condition was they actually fueled like constantly 40 grams every 20 minutes, I think. And giving them a lot of carbohydrates at the start coupled with low exercise intensity will probably cause insulin spike. And this insulin spike will suppress lipolysis, suppress fat oxidation rates, and you can actually end up with burning carbohydrates, not using fats at all. And this is also something you don't really want, especially in like 3-week long races, because you actually want to maximize fat oxidation rates, because just burning out the carbohydrates is not the best thing that you can do, especially when riding at low intensity. So that's kind of the reason why I kind of go with low carbohydrate at the start. And then when it actually becomes important, then this is when carbohydrates are the king, and that's when the ingestion rate is as high as possible.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. I remember you alluded to something on the Trainer Road podcast that you did. You alluded to the fact that you thought there might be some benefit, and that I think that you said like basically it certainly hasn't been researched. We're sort of out on the edges of like what's been researched for sure. But you thought there might be some benefit to like maybe overfueling carbohydrates in some cases, and we're not really sure why that might happen and why it's so effective for some riders. Have you given that any further thought?
Oxidation of the total glycogen pool in the body. We don't know whether it's liver or it's muscle, but we guess it's muscle. But this is something that we still don't really understand why it occurs, and whether this is connected to gastrointestinal discomfort, or is it like a metabolic thing that happens irrespective of the GI issues, or what it is. So we are not really sure about this. But I'm not too concerned if we go like super hard with carbohydrates towards the end of the like 4 or 5 hour long ride, like for instance from the first half of the ride. Because if the glycogen stores are low by the time anyway, like you can't really make them use even more because they're low anyways. So just overfueling with carbohydrates, if the gut allows, makes total sense. But it's just probably the first part of the ride that if it's easy intensity, then you probably don't really want to like go overboard with carbohydrates. Whereas, for instance, if a rider would go into a breakaway, well, then it's full on with carbohydrates from the start. And then it's like 90 to 120 from early on. So there is no sparing or low carbohydrates from the start in that case.
And you're saying that if a rider goes into a breakaway early in the race?
Yeah, so then it's carbohydrates from the start, because then the carbohydrate demands are definitely super high, and we actually want to kind of supply them with carbohydrates from early on. Because one of the things that people kind of forget, and it's super important, is you probably need around 90 minutes to actually achieve peak oxidation rates of ingested carbohydrates. In other words, if you start to ingest carbohydrates when you're actually low on glucose or in glycogen, you will probably need around 90 minutes to be able to actually push harder again. So you have to kind of take this into account and like start ingesting more carbs like 60 to 90 minutes before that occurs.
Yeah. Totally agree. And you mentioned that we're not sure yet in the research if that's being caused by some of the gut issues, and that resulting in a higher glycogen utilization and sort of a shift towards carbohydrate burning. Do we have any evidence that that's the reason? Like, is it that the gut is in a lot of discomfort and riders are just like shifting to carbs because it's kind of a higher relative effort?
No idea, really. Like, there is a lot of gaps in the literature in this area, and I think we kind of need to improve our understanding of this, how to kind of optimize ingestion rates, and also like to figure out whether like it's the size of an athlete or is it the power output that actually determines what you can actually oxidize. Is there a relationship at all? Can we actually train to absorb more carbohydrates, or we can just improve the tolerance to them? We don't really know, and these are all the questions that I think someone needs to to first ask and then answer in proper research studies in the future.
Yeah, we totally agree there. I hope that, I'm not sure we'll put this in the video. I'm going to share something with you. My wife and I are developing an app that helps people fuel, and I am hopeful that we're going to be able to contribute to a big data pool and sort of solve some of those problems for people, because I've been very frustrated by how slow the research is forced to move because of the quality that it must be and how hard it is to recruit subjects, etc. But we're going to end up having a really big nutritional data set, potentially like as big as like Strava, Training Peaks kind of data set, when people use our app and get recommendations for fueling and then say how it went and how they felt. And eventually there'll be like a chatbot feature that helps them like coach them through what would be an optimal like adjustment to their fuel, that sort of thing.
That sounds good.
But I'll be picking up the phone and calling you when I have questions, or maybe earlier. Let's see. Actually, a total curveball question that's not on my list. Earlier you mentioned that you like to give athletes basically some autonomy, some flexibility in how much they're fueling, and make it sort of a conversation. If you were in a scenario where you had to tell if you have to decide kind of like you do when you put carbs in their bottles for the races or give them solids or gels or however you do it, how do you decide like how much to actually give them, but then also keep it flexible? Is it that you just tell them, hey, don't come get that third bottle if you haven't gone through your first two? Or is it that you say drink like 80% of this bottle, and then if you don't feel like you need it, chuck it off? How do you manage the flexibility part when you have to put a finite amount of powder in the bottle?
I see. I kind of, in a way, I give them that flexibility that I say, well, like fueling is really, really important. So you have to really make sure that you have these amounts, or like get as closely as possible to these amounts. Or I would say, well, fueling here is not as essential. And so I would kind of say, well, if you don't make it here, it's not the end of the world. So try to do your best if you can to follow these recommendations. But it's not the end of the world if you don't make it. And the kind of, that traffic light system like red, amber, and green kind of work for me. Green means that you definitely need those carbohydrates. Whereas amber means, well, but you can still kind of, not take all of it. But I always give like a range. So green would, for instance, mean like 90 to 120 grams per hour. And even the riders would then know where, for instance, like 55 kilo riders, they would know that probably going over 100 grams per hour for them is not really an option because they're so small, the power is not as, and they also can't really tolerate huge amount of carbohydrates. Whereas like the larger guys would definitely want to go as high as possible, so 120 or even more, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes total sense. That's an awesome system. I think that's really rider-centric, rider-focused, which is really cool. So that's neat to hear. When you say your bigger guys go 120 or even higher, what's the highest carbohydrate amount a rider that you've worked with has ever self-selected to consume per hour?
It was close to 150 grams per hour. And it was on Giro d'Italia this year. And daily carbohydrate intake was on that day or for a few days, actually somewhere between 20 and 21 grams per kilogram of body mass per day.
21 grams per kilogram. And I'm assuming this rider weighed 70 kilos maybe-ish?
That was actually more like 60 to 65, somewhere in between that.
Okay, so we're talking about like 1,300 grams of carbohydrate in a day.
Yeah.
Nice. Sweet. Okay, next question. I think you posted like a satirical post about nutrition practices, and it had like a course profile, and it said and it had little marks on it that said, here's where you're going to consume X, here's what you're going to consume Y, here's where you're going to consume Z. And the things that you wrote on it were like silly things like keto ester or something. And you posted it to Twitter, and I looked at it and I laughed and I thought it was wonderful. And then I saw the comments and I'm like, wait, somebody's upset. I just want to say that I love that. And I hope that the world allows you to post more jokes about nutrition in the future.
That was it's a funny story. Yeah, so basically I was actually very pissed because of the journalists that were kind of analyzing what some other teams were having on the bikes, and they took photos of their plans, and the plans were exact to the kilometer, kilometer 25, the rider would take this, and the kilometer 50, the rider would take that. And then there were just symbols, so there was not even exactly written what it is. And they were trying to figure out guess what those symbols were meaning. And they were publishing this and talking about that. So I was well, in a way, we can actually be deceiving the opponents doing that. So we shouldn't really believe kind of post anywhere at the time. But then interestingly, that day that our guy won the stage, and I was okay, let's post this plan to the Twitter now and see what happens. And obviously, the media and everyone was in the evening, I got messages from the team asking me that they were getting questions from journalists about this nutrition strategy, and I was well, that's just a joke.
If it's okay with you, we'll post a picture of it in this video. Maybe we won't. We can talk about that. But the plan was very clearly, to anybody who has ever read cycling news article on basic fueling strategy, the plan was a joke. It was hilariously done. Yeah, and were there journalists that did they actually think that was the real plan? There
were nutritionists that thought that was the real thing.
No.
That's why I needed to kind of issue an apology the next day, because it just went out of the proportions. It was just all over the place. And I was oh, well, I need to kind of explain myself now.
I think the real failure here is not that you made the joke. I think the failure is that our field has failed to communicate good fundamentals to even those lower in our field who don't have PhDs. That is a disaster that any nutritionist could have looked at that plan and not immediately realized it was a hilarious joke. That's really alarming. Gosh. Well, let's do a better job in our field of education.
Yeah, but in a way, it's not really surprising, because if you look at what guys like Tim Noakes and his followers are posting, and those people have a PhD and they're even professors, and they post stuff that doesn't make sense. And yeah, so it's kind of, people are actually it's normal that they don't really know what's right and what's wrong. So I'm not really surprised, to be honest, or we shouldn't be surprised given the state of our field.
Yeah, that's true. There is, even from the top, there's a lot of I would call it misinformation, at the very least, conflicting information. And yeah, I can see how it would be very challenging for anybody who is not nutritionally literate, or even those who are trying to learn nutrition. I can see how it would be really challenging for them to learn and decipher what is accurate information. I think that's actually one of the reasons I became so passionate about this one niche area and pushing forward good information, because there's so much misinformation and conflicting information, and I think it goes back to it's a cycle of like whiplash that happens, sort of reactionary moves in the industry. It was a reaction to Gatorade over pushing hydration unnecessarily in an effort back in the 90s to sell more drinks. And then, it's just reaction after reaction. So I can see how people would not understand. But man, I thought your Twitter post was phenomenal. I would love to see more satire like that.
Yeah, I'm kind of scared to post more about it. Although I kind of sometimes try to do some funny jokes on Instagram, but definitely not on Twitter. And I think one of the problems with Twitter is basically that you are so limited in the number of words you can post, so that even like people that Tim Noakes, I still kind of admire him and I still agree on something that he has to say. And I think sometimes he says things, whereas I understand what he means, but most people, 99% of people, probably don't really know and get the wrong message. Because you can't really write a scientific article when you kind of post on Twitter. You can actually just use 140 characters or whatever the limit currently is. And we scientists are used to write long discussions and write the limitations of our work and etc. etc. And this is just not possible on Twitter. So sometimes we just do headlines, and those headlines are probably not 100% true. And if you're controversial, then this is a recipe for a disaster, I think.
Yeah. The challenge of people in our position is to make clear the complex topics that we cover in very few words so that people can digest it quickly. So I'm going to shift gears back into nerding out on carbs. But what's the highest total carb oxidation, even if it hasn't been found in research yet?
I think the breakdown of carbohydrates is very rapid. And I often like to say to my riders, when they start talking about the intensity was very low for the whole ride and they only done a few sprints or whatever. But if you look at the literature, even 3-second long sprints can actually halve the glycogen stores in the muscles, because the energy demand is so big in a very short period of time that you basically break down the glycogen to lactate, and this lactate doesn't really get back into glycogen, but is being oxidized as lactate for the over the next few hours. So basically you're burning what you started to burn earlier on. And total carbohydrate oxidation rates, or breakdown rates, can be super, super high. No idea what the values are, but
so if you had to put a number on a wild guess of what the upper limit hourly carbohydrate oxidation rate, not so much instantaneous or minute by minute, but hourly carbohydrate oxidation rate, what would you guess that it is for top of humanity?
Yeah, oxidation rate is probably 4, 5, 6 grams per minute. Yeah, I mean, if you calculate, probably you can do 300 or 380 watts, 400 watts. It's basically going to be just carbohydrate oxidation rates. And then if you assume, efficiency of 24%, then you can figure out what it is. Yeah, can't really do the math on the top of my head, but the math is going to be the numbers are going to be huge, really huge.
So let's get to maybe a slightly easier question with a narrower box of thinking. What do you think is the highest exogenous carb oxidation hourly possible by humans or by a human?
Good question. I think it's higher than what we think it is. We just need to figure out what actually limits exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates in the first place, because I'm not 100% convinced that the biggest limitation or the only limitation is actually absorption. I think we have other limitations downstream, so uptake from the muscle, and also what actually happens with carbohydrates once they're absorbed, because liver might actually take up some of the carbohydrates. So I think the question is very complex, and I'm pretty sure that with some thought and like more research, we can actually see that perhaps like exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates in certain individuals can actually be closer to like 150 grams per hour. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that there are people out there that can easily oxidize 150 grams per hour.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. I would say I was skeptical of your response, but I have one particular client who has reported that he has comfortably and enjoyably consumed 180 to 190 grams of carbs per hour on like a 3-hour bike ride. And I can't personally do that. I've tested sort of what my upper limit for gut comfort is, and it's not that. It's like 150, 155, and usually lower. But that's interesting to hear you say that you suspect that we might actually be able to burn that much, let alone consume it, which brings me to the next question. What is a typical percentage of carbohydrate consumed that is burned? Yeah, what's the percentage burned?
Yeah, so this is really like the question that it's a really important question, something that we kind of fail to sometimes appreciate when we like write articles and design studies. And the first thing is then when we kind of observe what happens with exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates. As I said earlier, there is a kind of a delay of 90 minutes that we actually see from like the start of the ride to when we actually see the peak exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates. And some say this like delayed peak is basically down to the fact that carbohydrates need to actually get absorbed. So basically you have to fill up the gut to fill up all the transporters. Actually, you can absorb all those carbohydrates. And that's why we kind of, in all studies and even in my study, we gave a lot of carbohydrates from the early on of exercise. And then we kind of use the ingestion rate so that the average was like 120 grams per hour, but at the start it was more. But even if we look at some of the studies that just looked at muscle glucose uptake during exercise without any carbohydrates being ingested during exercise, we actually see the same pattern, which is that at the start of exercise, the muscle glucose uptake is low and it only increases over time. So it peaks at around like 60 or 90 minutes and actually goes higher and higher. And what actually happens is there are two things. And the first one is, glycogen levels in the muscle are starting to go low, so carbohydrate demand in the muscle is going to go up. And basically muscle then decides to actually absorb more carbohydrates from the bloodstream. And the second thing is just the muscle contraction itself. It actually appears that you need some time to actually move the GLUT4 transporters to the muscle membrane. And that's why you kind of get this hour or an hour and a half long delay. So once you get all the carbohydrates in, then the demand by the muscles actually is rising. And there is a really cool study by Tim Noakes from, I think it was from 90s, Tim Noakes and John Hawley, when they actually, what they did was they clamped the glucose concentrations in the blood. So they infused the glucose at 10 millimoles. So it was like hyperglycemia all the time. And what they saw was the oxidation rate could actually go higher. And we are just talking about glucose now, because there is another aspect, which is lactate. And we know that the fructose part is actually very effective because fructose is getting converted to lactate, and concentrations of lactate increase in the blood. And because lactate concentration increases in the blood, there is a bigger concentration gradient between lactate in the blood and lactate in the muscle. So we actually get more absorption of lactate as well, and this gets oxidized as well. So probably we could even go higher than like 120 grams per hour with sufficient duration, sufficient carbohydrate demand, and optimal ratio of fructose to glucose carbohydrates. And
sufficient carbohydrate availability or intake too.
Yeah, obviously, yeah.
And that Tim Noakes study was that they did that via IV injection of glucose?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
They had like two trials, which was one was 5 millimoles, and then the other one was 10 millimoles. And it's kind of just to, like, proof of principle that muscle can uptake more. You just need a concentration gradient. And well, the concentration gradient is going to be even higher if you kind of go for longer or the exercise intensity is higher. So that, the demand for carbohydrates becomes higher as well. So it's kind of something that I would really like to see, like professional riders in the lab, like World Tour riders, and actually measure that in them, because I'm pretty sure that we could see like some crazy numbers there.
Yeah, get them on a bike for 5 or 6 hours and like pushing the intensity reasonably hard for 5 or 6 hours. I would agree that probably would have different numbers than what we see from when we recruit college students or like amateur riders and stick them on a bike for 90 minutes, 2 hours, 3 hours. Are there any studies, to your knowledge, that look at 5-hour efforts and carbohydrate metabolism, or like 5, 6, 7?
There is actually one study by Oskar Jokendrup, early 2000s. They were actually giving, I think it was 90 or 108 grams per hour of carbohydrates, 2-to-1 ratio versus probably 1-to-0 ratio. And they actually still saw a peak oxidation rates of like around 90 grams per hour, but this is purely because like that was basically the ingestion rate. And that was probably the only study that lasted for so long.
Yeah, Why do you think that is? Is it logistics? Like, why didn't your study go 4 hours, 5 hours?
People would kill me.
Yeah, that's why I'm not in research.
It's really hard. It's so hard to kind of get people to ride for so long indoors. Even for that study, we really struggled to kind of recruit people, and that's why I waited for this study to actually happen for so long. I planned to do it during my PhD in Birmingham, and I was like, well, I'm never ever going to get people that are fit enough and would be willing to ride for 3 hours, just below the first threshold, for 3 hours indoors. So then I tried to do it in Slovenia, and there I was a bit more lucky, or we were a bit more lucky. So we were able to kind of get sufficient number of people, but still it was hard. And I think more than 3 hours would be like mission impossible. Although I would love to do more than 3 hours, but yeah. And
it would be mission impossible simply because it's really hard to convince somebody to come sit on a lab bike for 4 hours or 5 hours. Yeah, it's really hard work. I mean, I've done sessions that are that long, but also like perhaps we should then think about the design a bit in a different way and just focus on the last like 2 hours of exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates and do some more like mimic more like race scenarios. So like some harder efforts at the start or like halfway through. So it's more interesting and more entertaining rather than just like right in the arrow mode for like 5 hours. That's just crazy. Nobody does that. Yeah, well, you'd be wrong. My wife has done that. But normal people don't do that. I think she's a pro, but she's the longest session she's done was right around that intensity for 5 hours on a trainer. I was running like bottles to her throughout her ride, and I think she did actually get off the bike maybe once or twice to use the restroom. But yeah, 5 hours on a trainer in erg mode, no less, no screen. Is just like I could not do that. No amount of caffeine would get me through that. I've done it myself a few times, but it was tough work. So my longest indoor session was 6 hours, and I've been doing some like heart rate drift data collection for Steven Zeiler back when I was a PhD student. So we were like kind of just trying to see when this heart rate drift would occur in me, because I was kind of always without heart rate drift. So we were pushing the limits of myself, and after like 4 hours, usually the heart rate drift occurs, but it was pretty hard work, and I wouldn't like to repeat it like 4 or 5 times, or how many times would be needed for a study. Yeah, oh my gosh. But would you say that you are unique in your, hesitate to call it an obsession, but I think obsessions are good because they drive humanity forward. So would you say you're unique in the research field in your sort of obsession with fueling and using yourself as a guinea pig, or is that sort of common to all researchers? It's not really common, I would say, although there are like many scientists that do that, and usually like knowing and experiencing stuff like makes a lot of sense. It's probably just the degree of how far people go, and I go like I like spend more than 700 hours on the bike each year, just so that I can like
get as close as possible to the best guys out there, whereas like some others probably wouldn't do that. Although I have to say that like David Rowland, which has done a lot of work in this area, has been like he's actually a really, really good bike racer. So he's probably been doing exactly the same over the last 20 years or so. So I'm definitely not unique in this sense.
Well, maybe not unique in a very niche, like cult of carbohydrate fueling performance nerds. But yeah, I think you're very unique in your willingness to be at the edge of what we know and really push at it. I think that's super, super cool. And I would say David Rowland is probably my second favorite researcher, second to you. What do you think we will find in the research or in our quest to find new information? What do you think will be found in the next 10 years?
I really hope that our field actually gets more and more funding, to be honest. I think that kind of the biggest problem we have. But like there are a few areas that kind of are developing and are improving our understanding of carbohydrate metabolism. So the first one is also the field that I'm working in, which is environmental physiology. So like how altitude or how the heat affect the carbohydrate metabolism. There is a lot of work in this area being conducted these days in various different labs. So we will better understand how to kind of fine-tune the recommendations based on the environmental conditions, or whether we should do like acclimation before hot weather riding, and whether this would affect like exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates or whatever. So this is one area. The second area I think that's going to be is getting a lot of attention these days is also like glycogen metabolism as such. So the importance of liver glycogen, the importance of muscle glycogen, and they're also like how these two pools are actually affecting fatigue. For instance, like there has been like a groundbreaking work conducted in Denmark, I think, on how the localization of glycogen particles within the muscle tissue actually affect fatigue and like the performance. I think this is like super cool, and it would be really interesting to see whether we can, with nutritional manipulations, actually affect these pools, so that we make sure that we actually kind of optimize the pools that actually matter in terms of performance. And the other thing is like we've done a lot of work in like how to optimize liver glycogen repletion rates. I mean, there are still some questions there to be answered. And the last thing is kind of we currently like give recommendations out as general guidelines, but I would like to see more like personalized advice. For instance, like I don't know, athletes go to see their physiologist or coach, and he does like lactate threshold testing. So perhaps we could down the line even get to the point where we would personalize the carbohydrate ingestion during exercise and figure out like, okay, you're limited like, I don't know, 60 grams per hour. So you should ingest a bit more than this for the sake of lost efficiency, but I don't know, you shouldn't be going to like 80 grams per hour. Or perhaps you can do like training the gut, and perhaps the next year or like in half a year, we measure again those oxidation rates and we see an improvement. So we can actually see that this is getting better and kind of work more individually rather than like provide athletes with general guidelines. So those three areas, I think, we'll see a lot of research coming in the next 10 years.
Awesome. That was beautifully said, and said so much like a researcher who's very delicate with, I would say, you're very good at not like overstating what we know, which makes you an absolutely amazing researcher. But I think you're also personally somewhat intuitive, and I would love to hear you. What do you think the answers will be in those fields if you had to predict based on like, I know you read a lot. Based on like your deepest thinkings, about the future, what are the answers going to be?
In terms of like the glycogen, I personally don't think we will be able to influence the different carbohydrate compartments in terms of like where you're going to fuel in that time window and then figure out and then improve the storage of that carbohydrate pool. But what I would really like to see is whether like once the pool that is kind of connected or like is causing the muscle to fatigue, if that pool is actually low in glycogen, can exogenous carbohydrate provision actually rescue this? And is it going to kind of, so we can actually see, well, okay, so when the glycogen stores in the pool are low, then we need to increase the carbohydrate ingestion rate during exercise, and then we can perhaps rescue this impairment in performance or muscle contraction. I've been trying to kind of look at this and see whether anyone has ever done like glycogen depletion in the muscle fibers, like isolated and then just add glucose, but I don't think at least I haven't found any evidence for that. So I think this is kind of the field that also needs some more evidence and more research. And I'm pretty sure that to a certain degree, carbohydrates can rescue this glycogen depletion. And we also know this from like practical perspective that if you fuel well during exercise that really large amounts, then you can probably have like a relatively low glycogen stores and then still be able to produce a lot of watts. And that's probably what like the best athletes are actually also doing, like in terms of like fatigue resistance. So what they do is like, first and foremost, they probably oxidize less carbohydrates, so less glycogen, but also they probably, once they're actually low on glycogen, which probably or definitely occurs at some point, they can still effectively use the carbohydrates that are still in the body or and actually oxidize fats as well. So I think this is kind of something that will probably be scientifically proven over the next 10 years or so, hopefully. And then personalization, I'm totally sure that we can personalize the intakes. We just need to kind of find a way how to do it. That would be like kind of in terms of cost effective. And I'm actually surprised that nobody has ever attempted to do this, to get people into the lab and measure oxidation rates and then try to prescribe ones. And perhaps it's the cost. The measurement is pretty expensive, but still like it offers a lot of information for the athlete. So I'm pretty sure this is something we're going to be seeing over the next years for sure.
Yeah, I hope so. That variable fueling rate, optimizing fueling rate based on intra-activity variability of intensity, I think is really cool and really fascinating. And also something you're totally right, we know nothing about, because almost everything is done steady state or steady state and then some higher intensity at the end, or maybe very planned sprint intervals, but it's never very real world, with various segments of the ride being various efforts. Yeah, that seems like a really big potential optimization. And I think it seems like it might be the key to getting that to the people is like, it has to be able to be made clear. And I think if I were a researcher in a lab still, I might hesitate to do research like that because it would be so hard to convey clearly to people. I mean, sure, you could generate a table like if your intensity is this relative to your threshold, then maybe consider these rates. And if your intensity is this, consider these rates. And if they're linked together in this certain ratio or timing during your ride, then adjust accordingly. But that's sort of like hard. That's a mouthful to tell to somebody who's like, how many carbs do I take today, coach?
Yeah, I think like it's actually like methodologically, it's not really difficult to actually do such like a project, because like many physiologists these days have like metabolic cards, so we can actually use the metabolic cards to actually determine this. It just takes some time to analyze the data because it needs to be sent out for the mass spec, and you need special glucose, a tracer. So with some some knowledge of some researchers from the labs, this can actually be easily done. And this is something that I would really like to actually see if we can apply into practice at some point in the future.
Yeah, totally. Why is fructose needed, and why does it work when added alongside glucose to allow higher carbohydrate intake rates?
Yeah, good question. So fructose, first and foremost, the fructose is absorbed from the small intestines into the bloodstream using a different transporter. So if you saturate the transporters for glucose, so like maltodextrin, for instance, or starch, you can absorb more carbohydrates or using the fructose transporter, so you need the fructose. So together with combining glucose and fructose, you can get eventually, in theory, more carbohydrates into the bloodstream. In addition to this, fructose can't really is never actually used by the muscles or the cells, but it first needs to go into the liver. Or actually the liver takes all the fructose that appears in the bloodstream. So in the liver, this fructose gets converted to either glucose, to lactate, or goes to glycogen at rest or after exercise, for instance. But during exercise, fructose gets converted to glucose, so it escapes the liver as glucose, and then you can just oxidize it, or it escapes as lactate and increases the lactate concentrations in the bloodstream, and then you get another fuel source for mitochondria. So lactate can then be used or oxidized in the mitochondria, just because eventually glucose is going to be broken down to lactate anyway. So then lactate can be used in the mitochondria. So this way, you get this higher concentration gradient for another fuel source. And it's always about concentration gradients, and that's really important when we talk about utilization of carbohydrates from the blood, because blood concentrations of glucose don't really go very high. And this is purely probably because of the fact that if we allowed blood glucose concentrations to go really high during moderate intensity exercise, this would then very quickly deplete the liver glycogen stores. And this is something we don't really want. Whereas with lactate, we get a small increase, and then the concentration gradient is a bit higher. And then we can actually oxidize more of those ingested carbohydrates because we get another fuel source, if that makes sense.
So you're saying, basically, I'm catching two big things that maybe listeners would like clarification on that might be new to them. One is one potential reason why we don't get super high blood glucose concentrations while we exercise is because the body has this tight regulatory control mechanism for the liver, so that we don't have high blood glucose. So the liver will sort of help control that. And also muscles are very insulin sensitive during exercise. And then the second point I hear you making, and correct me on any of this if I'm wrong, is that lactate is fuel. Lactate, in the 90s and 2000s, in undergraduate level and lay population, lactate was almost like a bad word. It was oh, I have high blood lactate, I'm in trouble. But lactate is a fuel, and it's really the acid accumulation that can be problematic along with other fatigue things. So when people hear lactate from fructose, it's not a bad thing. Lactate is fuel created by the liver for your muscles to burn. And because you consume fructose, your liver can output more lactate as fuel, and your muscles burn that lactate. And as far as I know, there's not a super high, well, there is a super higher upper limit for that than we currently know, and definitely much higher than what was thought 10, 20 years ago, which was 30 grams per hour of fructose max. And your study and others have shown that's not true. Would you say that I was close to correct on those?
Yeah. So one other thing that I probably forgot to mention is that during moderate intensity exercise, if you would get super high glucose concentrations in the bloodstream, what would happen would be that insulin levels would go up because glucose is tightly controlled. And if insulin went up during exercise, what would happen is, glucose would also go into the tissues that are not active during exercise. So this is something you don't really want. So you want actually to have maintained glucose concentrations and only get glucose into the muscle tissue, because muscles during exercise actually uptake glucose without the need of insulin, whereas other tissues still need the insulin. And if glucose concentrations went up, insulin would go up, and then you would get glycogen synthesis in, arm muscles during cycling, which is something you don't really want or actually need during exercise.
Carb loading your deltoids while you ride your bike.
Exactly.
So fructose sort of has a reputation for causing gut distress. Whether that's true or not is another story. But that brings me to a gut training question. It's sort of a popular thing floating around lay media lately. How much can we train the gut? Should we be training it? And really, how much adaptation can we expect? Can we expect to improve our carb tolerance by 10 grams per hour via gut training, or is it 40, 50 grams of carbs per hour?
So first, to answer the fructose question, it looks like from old studies, it looks as if fructose, when it's ingested on its own, it causes gut discomfort in many people. Whereas if you co-ingest glucose and fructose, these problems, in 99% of people, disappear. So basically, we know that if you co-ingest fructose and glucose for the same amount, like as compared to glucose only, you will get less GI issues with a combination. So there is basically, in other words, kind of addition of fructose improves the gut comfort. So it's actually a good thing to have during exercise. And then whether training the gut actually improves absorption. I think so. Training the gut on its own, I see it as improving as a way to improve tolerance to carbohydrates, because if you want to saturate all the transporters in the intestine, you actually have to fill up the intestine. Otherwise, you can't utilize all the transporters that are there. And it looks like you need the tolerance. Like not everyone can actually tolerate to have the intestines full of carbohydrate solution. You can actually improve that by doing the gut training. Whereas on the other hand, you could potentially also increase the number of transporters, like the concentration of the transporters per surface area. And I think this could occur, or probably does occur to a certain degree, with high carbohydrate diet on its own. Because it's not just exercise when you kind of bombard the intestines with carbohydrates, it's actually throughout the day that you kind of give and provide a lot of carbohydrates. So for instance, the idea that you would be on a low carbohydrate diet and for ages and then just raise with carbohydrates is not really good from this perspective either, because basically the intestines won't really know how to deal with all these carbohydrates that suddenly appeared there. So I think tolerance is really important, and I'm pretty sure that if somebody is not tolerant to carbohydrates, like even 60 grams per hour or 40 grams per hour, sometimes see runners that are struggling to actually eat a gel on the run, 20 grams. The gains can be really massive because we can easily improve the tolerance and be able to tolerate 60 grams and actually end up absorbing those 60 grams of carbohydrates. Whereas if you're tolerant to large amount of carbohydrates, whether you can actually improve the absorption in that case is something that's still debatable, and we don't really know. There is some rodent evidence that you can increase the number of fructose transporters, but not really glucose. But the evidence is it's not properly investigated. So we don't really know at the moment how this changes and whether it actually changes.
It sounds like we've been reading the same studies. Yeah, I'm familiar with that rodent research. And also with the idea that you can sort of train the gut, at least if there is a transporter increase, that you could train it around the clock, and it doesn't have to be all during training. Although that might be a good way to train the gut to the just simple fullness tolerance. Like when Michelle goes into race season, remind her we might actually want to increase the fructose content or the sugar content of your diet, the carbohydrate content of your diet, just to get you your gut ready to absorb all that for your race days, big training days.
Yeah. So one thing that and this is really rapid and really quick in most people actually. When I was doing the recovery studies, so it was glycogen depletion in the morning, and then it was 4 hours of recovery, eating with a lot of carbohydrates, on average around 90 grams per hour for 4 hours, and then jumping straight back to the bike or start running again until task failure or do a time trial, whatever. One of the things was that during the familiarization session, which was the first session that people came in just to get acquainted with the protocol and the procedures, many people struggled. And I was shit, this guy is not going to finish my study because he will just basically not make it through it. And they would usually people don't really want to admit that they can't do it. So they will just push and come back the next time. But the funny thing was that the first time they struggled, and then for the next 2 sessions that were just a week later, they had absolutely zero issues. In just 1 week and 1 session, 1 exposure to really high carbohydrate intake, and the problem just disappeared. It was so interesting to see this.
I had known that it was relatively fast. I had not known it was potential. I didn't realize that there could be a single session effect. That's incredible.
Yeah,
okay,
I was surprised as well, but it wasn't just one person, it was multiple people that responded in the same way. So I was oh, that's the real thing. Unfortunately, I wasn't collecting any data during the familiarization sessions. Otherwise, I would actually report this in the paper because this is like super interesting from my perspective.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That actually leads me to another question I had looked forward to asking, but after our conversation so far, I'm really excited to ask this question, which is, or what do you believe that you think maybe a lot of people don't agree with you on, but you still think you're right?
It changes weekly, but I think like still most people think that the absorption of carbohydrates from the intestines into the bloodstream is the limiting factor, whereas I think it's actually this is the case only in certain people, and that in many people with like normal high tolerance and like high carbohydrate intake on a weekly or daily basis, they can actually absorb carbohydrates. It's the fact that the muscles can't really oxidize and uptake those carbohydrates because the liver actually doesn't allow those carbohydrates to be actually released into the blood circulation, or like the insulin goes up and then we just don't we get glucose into the other tissues. So then I think people or like other scientists like to see this in a very simplistic manner, so that it's absorption from the intestines that's the limiting factor, whereas I think it's a multifactorial thing and way more complex than what we think we know. And I'm trying to write a literature review on this, but it's so big and so huge because there are so many different topics that one need to consider, just the glucose uptake into the muscle. And I haven't found the time to actually finish that literature review yet, but I think that's kind of what my belief is at the moment, and it kind of clashes with what others are believing.
Yeah, it does. That's really interesting, and I can totally see that. And if I'm understanding correctly, you're saying that especially in at least intermediate to advanced athletes, or at least people who are experienced with relatively regular high carb fueling, the limiting factor ceases to be the gut absorption and becomes what is available to the muscle in the bloodstream because of liver limitations. Is that an accurate summary?
Yeah, I don't know whether it's the liver or it's basically just the fact that the muscles just don't want to uptake more carbohydrates. And interesting, there are not a lot of studies with high intake rates that would measure actually the insulin and compare insulin between different conditions, because insulin analysis is pretty expensive and we usually try to cut down the cost, and we think, oh well, insulin is not going to go up during exercise, which is not really true, because it does go up, and the effects of this are not really well known. During exercise. And I think this is kind of driving the efficiency of when you go to 120 grams per hour ingestion rate, you only oxidize, I don't know, let's just say 100 grams. Whereas if you ingest 90 grams, you ingest almost 80 grams. So the difference is much lower. And then when you ingest 60 grams, you probably oxidize 55 grams. And this difference in efficiency, in my view, could be just down to insulin, because with high ingestion rate, insulin goes a bit higher, and that means the glucose or the carbohydrates that actually end up in non-active tissue. So this is something I would really like to see in the future also.
If insulin does go up some small amount during exercise due to really, really pushing the carbohydrate intake, and it's causing storage of glucose in other muscles that are not so active, is it possible that it could be causing storage in muscle fibers within the active muscles, but in muscle fibers that are completely dormant during exercise because the intensity is low enough that they haven't called upon those motor units yet?
Yeah, I think that's actually possible. And we know that very easy intensity exercise, you actually get a glycogen synthesis. So even if you see riders doing cool down after exercise, after a hard stage on the bike, actually glycogen is going to be synthesized at that time because intensity will be so low. So we actually see that if we do the biopsy. And this is also something that kind of, when you think about cycling races, they have descents, very long descents sometimes. And basically, in my view, you have to fuel those descents very well because, you can actually synthesize glycogen.
Totally agree. Every time I'm on a ride behind Michelle, who is much faster than me on a bike, because I'm a Cat 3, which is that's okay in the United States. But I'm also a 208 pound, so 94-ish kilos Cat 3. So I struggle to keep up with my wife. When I'm hanging on, I feel the descents very hard because it's my opportunity to get some energy back in my legs.
Exactly.
What is your most epic guinea pig moment where you've tested something on yourself and it was wild and crazy?
I think probably I was testing the core temperature sensor that you attach to the heart rate monitor should display the core temperature, the real core temperature. Yeah. So I was in Slovenia a few years ago, probably in March or something, and I got a portable rectal thermistor, so like the thing that you put into the back, and you get the real value. So I decided, let's test this sensor outside in the wild, and what I did was 6-hour long ride, and I had the thing for the whole 6 hours in there, outdoors. That was pretty fun. Probably that was kind of the craziest thing I did.
Did you go with anybody or were you solo?
I was with a friend of mine.
I feel like I have so many questions, and then you tell me an amazing thing that you thought of or that you have done, and I forget all my other questions because I'm so amazed. You mentioned earlier that runners might not fuel as much or might struggle to fuel as much as cyclists. Why do you think the running community generally fuels at a much lower rate than the cycling community?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's kind of started to change with Eliud Kipchoge, that actually started to push with high carbohydrate ingestion rates. And I think it's probably down to the fact that gastrointestinal discomfort is way more prevalent in runners because of the moving of the stomach and then intestines during running up and down. That kind of trigger the problems. This is one thing. And the other thing is, and I believe this is kind of really important, is that runners, they exercise for an hour, 2 hours max on a day, whereas cyclists, they ride for 4 or 5 hours. So the energy expenditure is much higher in cyclists than it is in runners. So as a result of that, runners actually eat smaller amount of food on a daily basis. And what tends to happen, at least that's what I see, is that runners have a lot of fiber in their diet. They really like to eat veggies. They eat lots of fiber, like porridge oats in the morning and stuff like that. And this just contributes to the problems they have then later on during the run. And once they get those problems for the first time, they will start to fear of those problems. And these problems will never ever go away because they can actually be triggered just by the psychology. So you would fear something would happen, and then you would just so stressed and nervous that the hormones that are responsible or contributing to these problems would be released into the bloodstream, and then the problems would actually develop.
You're actually the first person I have heard mention that, and I think that's really, really astute. That it's almost like a positive feedback mechanism for some people. When they have that first bad experience, the fear kicks in and they limit carbohydrates further, and psychology absolutely affects the gut. I actually have a funny anecdote that I share with my clients whenever they are unsure if psychology can affect their gut. And it's one of a dog that I was babysitting. It was in my office. I was in an office building, and I had papers in my office on the ground level, the floor of the office. And this dog was a young dog and was in the process of being trained, and it started eating and shredding my papers. They were probably our liability waivers for all of our athletes. So important papers. And I heard it was a common problem that had been happening. And I heard the dog starting to shred the papers behind me while I was working on my computer. And I slowly turned around and looked at the dog, and it was still just going to town on the papers because they didn't notice that I'd turned around. And I said, "No." And the dog instantaneously vomited on the floor. And it wasn't because it had been eating the papers. It was literally a psychological, neurological response to the startle response was the dog threw up immediately. So I would say there's pretty strong connection between psychology and gut, if anybody doubts that.
On the day and the days before, even though we say fiber is really good for health, yes, sure, it's very good for health, but not before and during, before exercise, because you don't want anything else in your intestines other than carbohydrates, glucose and fructose. That's it. Yeah. You don't want something that can't be digested.
Yeah, Totally. I'll just repeat that because that's a huge, important message that people need to hear. Fat, fiber, and protein does not go with carbohydrate fueling. And you probably should, you should definitely limit fiber before your events because it slows down everything in your gut and it makes it more complicated for your gut to do the job that it needs to do. So if you're a runner and you're having GI issues, limit fiber pre-training and definitely limit fiber intra-training. And that highlights this is like a pet peeve of mine that I see a lot of carbohydrate supplement fuel type companies that they target fueling products for runners and they include things like fat, fiber, and protein in their products, in their gels. And it's like, you wonder why runners struggle. It's like half the products that are marketed towards them, advertised for them, have fiber in them.
Yeah, like it's sometimes when you see like what those companies are actually like putting into the products, like it's so funny. Even like protein bars, like, oh well, we need protein, we need to eat protein, and then you start eating protein bars, and then you take one protein bar and you just take another one because it's good, like, and protein is good for you, and then you figure out like a few hours later you have like GI issues. I always have GI issues when I have more than one protein bar. And the reason for this is that it has alcohol sugars in it. So like it says 0 carbs. So where is the sweetness coming from? From alcohol sugars. And those alcohol sugars are usually causing problems in the intestines and in the gut and cause digestive problems. So I don't know, like people like really love to say carbs are bad and they just like remove them from the products, and then they add some alcohol sugars which are like even worse in terms of like what they do to our bodies, and just amazing.
It is amazing. It's amazing. Yeah. I feel like sometimes product development teams at supplement companies are led as much by the advertising team as they are by their lead scientist.
Yeah, exactly.
What things do you think should be talked about that we haven't talked about or that aren't talked about enough in sport fueling?
I think it's fueling for the work required. I think this is kind of super important. Like I often see this problem with athletes I work with professional athletes and with like amateur athletes, and which is like you probably have like an idea of what your next training session is going to be like, and you have to fuel in advance for that training session rather than like, oh, I've just done like a 5-hour long ride. Now I can eat a lot. Yeah, well, and the next day is like a rest day. Well, perhaps you don't really need to eat that much because it's a rest day coming up. Whereas you have to fuel in advance. I think that's kind of the most important message. Kind of think what the requirements of the next training session are going to be. Oh, it's going to be a very demanding training session. Okay, this means I need full glycogen store, so I will have more carbohydrates before that session. This doesn't mean eat more calories. It's just that you eat less fats and less protein to actually fill up the glycogen stores as much as possible. And then when you start to think about what's for the next training session, okay, the next training session is very easy. Perhaps you don't need as much carbohydrates. So, okay, let's add some more healthy fat into the diet, for instance, and just manipulate from that perspective, rather than say, oh, well, I've done a hard training session and now I can eat. I think that's kind of the wrong message. And this is kind of the thing that kind of fueling on the bike can't really rescue this. It can to a certain degree, but if you have glycogen stores very low at the start, you can't really just overcome this by just fueling as much as possible. Because, well, if we said earlier, we can break down 5, 4, 6 grams of glycogen per minute, we can only absorb, up to 2.5 grams per minute. So it's always, we need the glycogen. Without glycogen, we can't do high intensity interval training sessions.
Yeah, if you have high intensity stuff coming up, walking into that ride with empty glycogen tanks is like the recipe for disaster. How real world, how frequent is it, do you think, that athletes end up going into a session with insufficient glycogen stores to the detriment of the quality of that workout?
Oh, very often. Too often.
Got it. What persona or what level of athlete tends to do that the most, tends to experience that the most?
I think it can be everyone in a way. Even in professional riders, one of the things that I never got was when you see what they eat on a rest day, it's actually very low amount of carbohydrates because it's a low amount of foods in general. And that doesn't make sense to me, because if the next day is like queen stage, for instance, I would love to see them eat lots of pasta and actually fill up the glycogen stores, because they actually have 36 hours of recovery, or even close to 48 hours of recovery. And we know that you need more than 24 hours to fill up the glycogen stores. So this is a really good opportunity to actually fill up the glycogen stores for the next stage. So they don't get this. And even in amateur riders, sometimes you have for instance, coach prescribes your rest day, and then you have a really high intensity interval training session the next day. And then you say, well, oh, it's a rest day today, so I will just eat very low amount of carbohydrates and foods in general because it's a rest day. But no, you have to fill up for the next training session. Perhaps after the next training session, if the next day is again a rest day, then you can perhaps eat less because, well, for the rest day, you don't need the energy. But for the training session, you definitely do.
That makes sense. So if you could make a recommendation, would it be something like, fuel the work, fuel ahead for the work?
Yeah. So always just look what next training session is like. And then if you see some intervals, that means you need carbohydrates. And if you see a steady state recovery ride, it's easy session. You can actually benefit from perhaps having less glycogen and actually try to train the body, let's say, to oxidize more fats. And this could actually work very well. It's called carbohydrate periodization. I think it kind of makes sense, because the higher the exercise intensity it is, the more carbohydrates you actually need. And the lower exercise intensity, the less carbohydrates you need.
Yeah. So that actually, carbohydrate periodization is probably one thing we haven't touched on it yet, and it's definitely a hot button topic that I see coming in to the foray here in the next year or so, becoming a bit more mainstream. Of course, there's a pretty good niche following of some sort of that going on already, but my hunch is that it comes out as a wash if the person is doing a reasonable amount of low intensity riding. But maybe do you have experience or evidence to say that the fat oxidation has to have dietary manipulation to be caused?
I don't really think that this is the case in most people, that you do it in hypoglycemia and you basically yourself up even more, or basically you should when you plan your meals, that for instance before intense training sessions, you make sure they have more pasta, less protein, less fat, whereas you choose the fish salmon that has a lot of fat before low intensity training sessions, so that you just redistribute the intake of carbohydrates. You still eat carbohydrates all the time. It's just that you just make sure that you have all the carbohydrates, most of the carbohydrates, enough carbohydrates before high intensity training sessions, if that makes sense.
That makes total sense to me. Maybe we should change the term to carbohydrate matching instead of carbohydrate periodization. I feel like carbohydrate periodization definitely has that feel that okay, some days I'm just going to really restrict carbs so that I can get my fat ox up. But I feel like carbohydrate matching is better. Just match it to the work that you're going to do, match it to the carbohydrate burn that you're going to probably experience, and a little bit front loaded so that you're prepped for what's ahead.
Yeah, that kind of sounds, it makes sense.
I don't think we can sell carbohydrate matching though. Carbohydrate matching is not a sexy term. What terms or words or even products are primarily in vogue or in recommendation, are being recommended primarily because they're sexy or they sound cool and sciencey, but could be done with something simpler?
Yeah, I guess all those carbohydrate gels and fancy isotonic drinks and all those sorcery that companies are selling, which is basically just sugar in various different forms. And when you say isotonic, it's just a term that nobody actually knows what it actually means. And I'm pretty sure that nobody actually measures osmolality or osmolarity of those drinks at all in the labs of those manufacturers. They just claim it's isotonic drink because everybody says it's an isotonic drink, whereas that really, the term doesn't really matter. And it's basically just carbohydrates. And then they start talking about different types of carbohydrates, like maltodextrin of that sort, maltodextrin of that sort, whereas they forget to put in any fructose at all. So you try to optimize something that's limited in the first place, and you just avoid fructose because somebody once said that fructose is bad for the health. Things like that. It's very annoying when there are only a few manufacturers out there that use the correct ratio that's close to unity, so almost 1-to-1 fructose to glucose. And it's so rare to actually see sucrose being promoted as like a good sports nutrition food, whereas like sucrose, like table sugar, is like almost as good as it can be, and it's cheap, and it's accessible, and just have sucrose in the bottles. That's perfectly fine. You don't need to like buy fancy drinks if you don't want to, or if you're like low on budget.
Because I looked so hard through the literature to find a reason not to use sugar, because I wanted to believe that the maltodextrin was better, like it would be better, and I would feel better and perform better, or that Michelle would. And I couldn't find convincing evidence of it. My best reason for using some maltodextrin in a beverage is if people don't like the sweetness of sugar. That's a fair reason, because a lot of folks have like sweetness aversion during training.
Yeah, and this could like be potentiated in the heat. I think that's kind of in the hot weather. I think maltodextrin could be preferred because of that. Also, perhaps like hydration might be slightly better with maltodextrin, but otherwise, sugar is just as good.
That's a good point. Yeah, when you're really at the limit of like being able to stay hydrated because your water loss via sweat is so high, making sure that everything is absolutely perfectly optimal might include maltodextrin. Yeah, that might be a topic for another time. Actually, I have another question. What are you going to have for your carbohydrate meal when you get off this call?
I'm going to have pancakes.
With sugar, like sprinkled sugar on, or like syrup poured on it?
I haven't decided yet, but it's going to be like sugar or some jam or something, like just carbs.
Beautiful. Okay, until next time, Dr. Podlogar, appreciate you being on.
Thanks for the invite, and it was fun chatting to you.
Very much likewise.